All right. If we're ready to go, we have a QR code. We have the beginning of Job here. And so get into our presentation, and we will begin with questions for investigation. I'll give you just a second. I think everybody probably already got into that. Questions for investigation number 1. The book of Job is primarily made up of what? Is it poetry, prophecy, narrative, or letters/epistles? What is the primary form used in the book of Job? Okay, well, I said not to. That's weird. It is, even though I told it not to. That is weird. It's off now? Okay. Maybe it's just a lagging thing. All right, so 12 people responded. Let's see what we got here. 92-8 say that it's primarily narrative. All right, we will see in just a few moments. Second question. Which of the following is true of the book of Job? Job's afflictions were directly tied to his sin. Job, now I know I just clicked that one. I really did. There has to be some kind of lag going on. Anyway, Job's afflictions were directly tied to his sin. Job lived in the period just after Esther. Satan is a title, not a proper name. Okay. 83% Satan is a title, not a proper name. A few are going with the time period after Esther. Makes sense because Job is the book that comes after Esther. That's why I put that down as an answer. All right. Let's see if I can get those turned off. Which of the following is true concerning the biblical view of suffering? The biblical view of suffering. We'll actually talk a little bit tonight about some different things that the Bible indicates about suffering, but overall, what is true? In the New Testament, suffering is synonymous with sickness. God brings disasters on his children to teach them lessons. Sometimes we never get an answer to the question, why? Which of those is a true statement that reflects the biblical view of suffering? Most say sometimes we never get an answer to the question why. We've got a few going along the line of the disasters for the children. All right. Overview of the writings. So we are entering now a completely new phase. We started in Genesis chapter 1 2 years ago. 2 years ago, January, almost 2 years ago. We are at the last, by the way, this is the last Wednesday night Elba session of the year. We will not have Wednesday night Elba session on Christmas Day, nor on January 1st. So the next time we will meet on Wednesday nights is January 8th. We started January of 23 in Elba, and we started in Genesis 1, and we've gone all the way through Esther. In other words, we've gone all the way through the storytelling. I don't mean that in a fictional way, of course, but the narrative portions of the Bible, the history books. And now we have arrived at the beginning of the next section of the Bible, which is called the writings. After the writings, we have, of course, the prophets. And so since we're entering a completely new section of Scripture, it's worth taking a look here and seeing what's going on here with the writings. Now, I was thinking about taking either an entire week for this or doing more, but I decided to just do something short and to the point here and get the point across. But we need a little overview here of the writings, and so here it is. In our Bibles, English Bibles, Protestant Bibles, We have the following books that we call the writings. They are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. The very next book is Isaiah, and that's the beginning of the prophets. I've said this before in a previous lesson, but in the Hebrew Bible, there are many more books that are considered part of the writings. You have the Torah, the first 5 books. You have the prophets, but you have the writings, which includes these 5 books plus several other books, including Ruth and Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Lamentations, and the Chronicles are all part of the writings for the Hebrew Bible. We kind of narrow that down to just these 5. We include some of those other things with the prophets. Makes sense because they were prophetic literature. We include some of them with the historical narratives because they're historical narratives, okay? The writings in our Bible, these 5 books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, are primarily poetry, including Job, and we'll get to that here in just a second. Poetry is the genre in these 5 books. Now, Job is unique in that it combines narrative with poetry, but it is by far mostly poetry. We think of Job as a story, and it is. And so we think narrative. But if you look, and we'll look here in our Bibles in just a second, if you just flip through, by far most of the chapters are poetry, and only a few chapters are narrative. Okay. So, let's talk just a little bit about interpreting the writings or this poetry as well as prophecy, because we'll get to that very soon as well. It's a little different. It's very different to read, and so it's a little different in the way we interpret. It's a little different in the way we process. It's not to say that it's hard to understand or you can't understand it or anything like that. It just takes a little extra effort. And when you think about poetry, you can get that picture of how that, just in English poetry, how that would be a different, if you remember back to English class, high school English, poetry was always one of my least favorite things that we did. But you had to find that meaning. What are they trying to say here, right? And in other words, it's not as straightforward. When you read the narratives, like we just did, from Genesis to Esther, for the most part, you read that thing, and it says what it says, and it means what it means, and you know what they're talking about. With some exceptions, because sometimes we still kind of need to know the background of what was going on then to really understand what they're saying. But when we get to the poetry and then the prophecy after that especially, we're going to need to know more background to really understand what is coming across to that reader at that time, but then also to us. The Blue Letter Bible, I think I've pitched this before to you guys, but the Blue Letter Bible is a great resource. It's free. It's an online Bible, and blueletterbible. something. And you can click on each verse, and it will bring up commentaries that are pretty good. You can kind of read each one, and it has some sound, in other words, audio recording of commentaries. They have line by line, interlinear. You can see the Hebrew, you can see the Greek. You can click on each word and get the meaning from the lexicons for each word. You guys can do that. And I recommend that. And so when I say it takes a little extra effort sometimes to understand, those are the kinds of efforts we can put forward to understand these poetry and also coming up prophecy. Okay, a couple of little things about Hebrew poetry and how we interpret it and so forth. One is parallelism. Hebrew parallelism. This is the idea that I have a line of the poetry and then I have a second line that parallels the first line. What do we do with those parallel passages? Well, let's take a look at an example. Proverbs 24, verse 3. Proverbs 24, verse 3 says this: "Through wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established." Through wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. Now, I used to read a verse like that, and I would go try to dig in and try to figure out the difference between wisdom and understanding. Wisdom is going to do this thing over here. It's going to build the house. And understanding is going to establish the house. And how is that different? And really trying to get down into the nitty-gritty. Well, there's nothing wrong with that per se, and you might actually get something from that. And in fact, I'm going to do exactly that on Sunday with a piece of poetry that we will look at as we talk about the birth of Jesus. However, the general thing regarding this parallelism is they mean the same thing. It's not how is wisdom different from understanding. It's the parallelism is there to draw attention. These two statements basically mean the same thing. By wisdom a house is built, by understanding it is established. It is a literary device to simply draw our attention to that thing in a poetic way, and they basically mean the same thing. If you want to go dig in and try to understand the difference between wisdom and understanding, knock yourself out. Okay? But really, the meaning that is coming across by that device is these mean the same things. Now, sometimes you'll get a two-line parallelism, and they're opposites. Okay, but it's pretty easy to see which one's which. But I just wanted to bring that across because we will see that a lot over the course of the writings. Okay, and then the next piece here in terms of interpretation is the idea of principles versus promises. It is easy, and perhaps too easy, for us to read the writings, the poetry, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and read a piece of poetry that has a principle in it, and then we receive that thing as if it were a promise. Let me give you an example. Psalm 91, verses 9 and 10. Psalm 91, verses 9 and 10 says this: "Because you have made the Lord, who is my refuge, even the Most High, your dwelling place, no evil shall befall you, nor shall any plague come near your dwelling." And so Christians will take a verse like that and receive it as a promise and claim it, and then we'll say, no plague is going to come near my dwelling. Okay? And then when a plague comes near our dwelling, we're shocked. Okay? It's because it's a principle and not a promise. Now, grain of salt. John G. Lake took some of these principles that were promises that are principles, and he treated them as promises, and he went around the western United States and South Africa and healed everybody that came within his reach. And they put disease in his hand and it shriveled up and died under the microscope. So I don't want to go too far with this idea of principle and promise. I don't want to discourage you from receiving these wonderful pieces of scripture and even taking them to the Lord as a promise. I'm not going to be the one to tell you not to do that. Okay? Here's the bottom line. When we take something that is a principle, in other words, it's generally true. When we take something that's a principle and we treat it as a promise and then it doesn't happen, and then we turn around and start blaming God and saying, you said and now it didn't happen, that's where we have a problem. In other words, it all comes back to posture. And so the scholars tell me that when we read the Hebrew poetry, we are seeing things like this that are principles rather than promises. And yet, the faith man in me wants to say, hearing mixed with faith, if you receive that thing as a promise and by faith you grab hold of it, go for it. Does that make sense? And I think sometimes we do that maybe out of ignorance, but sometimes we just do it out of faith. We receive that thing. You know what, Lord? I'm receiving this as if it's a promise, whether it is or not. And I'm going to roll with it. But what we can't do at the end of the day is say, okay, well, that didn't happen, so now I'm mad at God. Okay. That is a pretty decent segue to the book of Job. Because here we have a character who does nothing wrong and yet is viciously attacked by the enemy with permission from God. And he did not turn around and say, well, wait a minute, I thought I was supposed to have all these promises and blessings. Where are you at, God? He does say, where are you? But he never does make the mistake and the sin of having the wrong posture toward God to blame and not receive well the things that are happening. He receives it very well. He, in pretty much all respects, he goes through his situation correctly. And so with that, let's take a look at, and this is wild. It's going like all back and forth. Let's take a look at the book of Job. Topic tonight is Job. Okay, I'm going to cover this fairly long book in only 2 sessions, okay? And so, as you can imagine, I just want to throw out some principles. I want to throw out some highlights. But let's take a look at the outline first. It's broken up into 3 parts. The first 2 chapters are narrative. They give the story of Job's affliction. And we'll see that in just a second. We'll read through that. Chapters 3 through 41 are the dialogue between Job and his friends, and at the end, God chimes in. That dialogue, so watch this, chapters 3 through 41, almost all the chapters, 39 out of 42 chapters of the book are poetry. And if you flip through, if you have a paper Bible, it'd be easier to see. But you can see it on the e-Bible as well. If you look at chapter 2, it looks like prose. You turn the page, it's going to look entirely different. Starting in chapter 3, you're going to see that line by line poetry form. So chapters 3 through 41 are poetry. So Job is primarily poetry. Even though it's a story, it's primarily poetry when we get into this dialogue of the friends. Chapter 42, of course, is the story of Job's restoration, and that goes back into the narrative form. But it definitely is the book is mostly poetry. Okay, was there a question? Oh, okay. With that, I'm going to set this aside, actually, and let's read through most of the first couple chapters, and I'll give some commentary along the way, all right? So Job chapter 1, verse 1. Okay, here we go. Job chapter 1, verse 1 says, there was a man in the country of Uz named Job. Uz, we don't know for sure where that is, but people think either Aram or Edom, most likely Edom, which would be in the area we would now call Jordan, southeast of the Dead Sea. This timing of the character of Job, when did he live, and when was the book written? Job was in the category of the patriarchs. He was before the law of Moses, and probably lived around the time of Abraham, somewhere in that range, Okay? So even though the book of Job is in the middle, it really goes, and if you ever read a chronological Bible, right, it'll have Genesis, and then it'll have Job, and then it'll have Exodus. Because this is right around it with the Genesis time frame before Exodus. Okay, it says he was a man of perfect integrity who feared God and turned away from evil. Some translations will say blameless and upright. And that brings us to one of our first points here, which is that Job never did sin in the story. Now, he had a sin nature, to be sure. In other words, he's a descendant of Adam. He's a descendant of Noah. He is a human being with a sin nature. And so he also certainly sinned individual sins at some point in his lifetime, childhood, teenagehood, early adulthood. But in the book of Job, Job never did sin. Coming into the story, he was blameless and upright. All the way through the reactions to everything bad that happens to him, he never does sin. So what happens to him is not a cause and effect relationship of him doing something wrong, and this is what happened as a retribution. It's simply not the case. Some people, especially in the Word of Faith type community, will point to a verse that says that he says, what I feared would happen has happened to me. And they'll point at that and say that Job sinned in having that fear, because we're not supposed to have fear, and then that's what caused it. No, totally disagree with that. Okay, so if Job is blameless before he was attacked, and he never sinned throughout the entire book, then there's a few things we can take away. One, it wasn't Job's fault. Two, God allowed it but did not instigate it. God is not the actor in saying, I'm putting this thing on you. The answer to the question why is never given. And that is the key element of the Job syndrome. Now, one of the reasons why I'm only taking 2 sessions to do the book of Job is because we have a fabulous resource on the book of Job in our library back there. It's called The Job Syndrome. The book was written by my father, John R. Miller. And by the way, anytime we talk about books on the bookcase back there, if that's something where you don't have the funds to do that, just come talk to us. We're not saying that so that we make money. You understand? Well, we're also not going to just give them away either, because we give them away and then they sit on your shelf, and that doesn't do anybody any good. If you're interested in it and you want it and you will read it, come see me, okay? But otherwise, they're back there. So we have this resource that my dad put together. It's based on his dissertation, and it's very good. And the answer to the question why is the key there. People that go through a Job syndrome don't get the answer to the question why. And that's part of the mystery, where we just look and we say, I've got nothing, but yet I will still follow you. Okay? Though he slay me. Finally, God is never to blame for evil or loss or negative circumstances for the believer. All right. Let's keep going in our reading here. Verse 2, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His estate included 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large number of servants. Job was the greatest man among all the people of the East. So this is a rich man. This is a blessed man. Okay, let's drop down to verse 6. One day the sons of God, we learned about the sons of God from Pastor Jeff's series on the big picture. If you weren't here for that, that is your loss, but there are videos. One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. Stop. Who came with them? It says Satan, and depending on your translation, most translations will say Satan, but it is truly the Satan. In other words, the our idea that we call this character, and there is a character. I'm not saying that there's not a character. There's a chief enemy of our enemies. And we call him Satan or the devil, and he goes by many, many names. And we do believe that that is the character being referenced here. But truly, it is the Satan in the book of Job and other places too. In other words, the accuser, the adversary. And so it's his title, not his name. And as we were going through the Big Picture series, as we were talking through some of these things, I said, you know what? As we go through these things, I'm not seeing a name for this character anywhere. Because normally we'll look and say his name is Lucifer, right? Well, Pastor Jeff kind of debunked that. Not kind of, he did. Okay, Lucifer is not a name given to this character. It actually means morning star, in other words, Venus. And so you go through all these names of this character, Satan, and you realize they're not proper names. I'm not sure we ever get his name. And so what does that tell you? It tells me that his name isn't that important. In other words, he's you talking about number 1 and number 2? You're talking about NFL and middle school team. All right? And that's not even a good comparison. There is no comparison between Satan and God. Amen. Okay, so it is the Satan comes to attack Job. And so he comes to the Lord first, the Satan, and the Lord asked the Satan, "Where have you come from?" "From roaming through the earth," the Satan answered him, "and walking around on it." Then the Lord said to the Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil." Here's God's number 1 man. And he is allowing his number 1 enemy free reign, almost not quite free reign. He doesn't let him do anything he wants. He has boundaries, but he's allowing this attack. He's not instigating the attack, but he's allowing the attack. And we really never get the real answer to the question why. We know that it's really for his glory. Everything. I used to have a friend in high school, and he was a little bit of a weird, odd duck. And you would ask a question, and he some random question, whatever. And his answer was always 42. And it was a non sequitur. It didn't make any sense. 42. Okay. Well, where was I going with that? Yeah, for his glory. It's always the same answer at the end of the day. It's for his glory. It's not 42. It's the answer to all the questions that this Bible points to is it's all for his glory. So we can always get there. But as a zoomed in level, we don't really get the answer to the question why. But God allows this, and Satan takes him up on the offer. So verse 9, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he owns, and he will surely curse you to your face." "Very well," the Lord told Satan. "Everything he owns is in your power. However, you must not lay a hand on Job himself." So thus Satan left the Lord's presence. One day when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and reported, "While the oxen were plowing and the donkeys grazing nearby, the Sabeans swooped down and took them away." Now the Sabeans are most likely nomads from northern Arabia. "Sabeans swooped down and took them away. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." He was still speaking when another messenger came and reporting, "A lightning storm struck from heaven. It burned up the sheep and the servants and devoured them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." That messenger was still speaking when yet another came and reported, "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands." Now the Chaldeans come from where Abraham came from, right down in the Babylon area. 2 different time periods, but Iraq. "Made a raid on the camels and took them away. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." He was still speaking with another messenger. Are you getting the idea of the Job syndrome, right? It's everything all at once. He was still speaking when another messenger came and reported, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. Suddenly a powerful wind swept in from the desert and struck the four corners of the house. It collapsed on the young people so that they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job stood up, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshiped. His first response was to worship God. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Praise the name of Yahweh. Pastor Bud talks about reading the Bible romantically. We can read this story just like I did very quickly and say, all this stuff happened to Job. Okay, and then here's what and now we go to chapter 2. Satan comes to the, wait a minute. Take a second. And let's get into this story and let's feel what this fella is going through. You've got to take a minute to get into this setting and really get the power of what all has happened to this man. Now, a way to help you with that is to read the book, The Job Syndrome. Because in that book, every chapter has a modern example interviewing people that have gone through terrible things, and you get that your heart is pulled. In each of those chapters, with each of those stories, they tell it in a way, and my dad does a great job of telling the story, and it tells it in a way where you can really be grasped by that thing and really feel and have the empathy of the person that's going through the Job syndrome. But look at the last verse of chapter 1. Throughout all this, Job did not sin or blame God for anything. So again, he comes into the story. It wasn't his fault. In everything that happened, he didn't do anything wrong. And all the way through the book, he never does do anything wrong. Wow. But wait, there's more. That's phase 1. Satan comes back in chapter 2. One day the sons of God came again to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself. The Lord asked the Satan, where have you come from? From roaming through the earth, the Satan answered him, and walking around on it. And the Lord said to the Satan, have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity, fears God and turns away from evil, maintains his integrity, even though you incited me against him to destroy him without just cause. Verse 4, skin for skin, Satan answered to the Lord, a man will give up everything he owns in exchange for his life, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. Very well, the Lord told Satan. The Lord knows that Job's going to pass the test. He knows. Job maybe didn't know. If you came to Job at the beginning and said, hey, if all this stuff happened, what do you think you would do? I don't know, maybe he would, but the Lord knew. Very well, the Lord told Satan, he is in your power. Only spare his life. So you can't kill him, but you can attack him in bodily form. In other words, sickness, disease, etc. So Satan left the Lord's presence and infected Job with terrible boils from the sole of his foot to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery to scrape himself while he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, do you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die. And Job said, you speak as a foolish woman speaks. Should we accept only good from God and not adversity? Throughout all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Then Job's 3 friends come, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite. They heard about all this adversity that happened to him. Each of them came from his home. They came like a long way to come meet him. They met together to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. They looked from a distance. They could barely recognize him. Everybody ever seen anybody you barely recognize them? Because of all they're going through. They wept aloud, and each man tore his robe and threw dust into the air and on his head. Watch how the friends get it. They have the empathy. They see they're there. Tore their robe and threw dust in the air and on his head, and they sat on the ground with him 7 days and nights, and no one spoke a word to him because they saw that his suffering was intense. the friends had the right approach. And sometimes we need to be able to know when to not say. And, so many times we can just say, I know there are no words, but I'm here and I love you and I'm sorry and we're praying for you. And that's all you can say. And the person gets that. And maybe later they come and they say, I appreciate what you did or whatever. But so many times when people are going through stuff, they don't need to hear a sermon. Chapter 3 is where Job begins to speak, and he doesn't curse God, but he curses the day he was born. He wishes that he had never been born. That's how bad it is for Job. And so that brings us through our passage for tonight, and we'll come back to it with the second look, but let's go into our exercise. Exercise is discussion. I figure since we had new groups, we'd have double discussion tonight, all right? So take a few minutes in your groups and you can discuss these questions. What was your favorite part about Job 1 and 2? It's a sad story. What was your favorite part and why? What lessons can we as Christians learn from Job 1 and 2? Just talk about that for a few minutes. All right, very good. Let's go to the second look segment. Second look segment tonight, I want to talk about the theology of suffering. Theology of suffering. First point I want to make here is to kind of define suffering. You need to understand, and I know we've talked about this before, but it's been a while. In the New Testament, when you see the word suffering, it does not mean sickness. It could mean sickness. In other words, it's part of what the word could mean. But in the context of how it's used, every time you see the word suffering in the New Testament, it is talking about persecution for the faith. In the New Testament, every time you see the word suffering, it is talking about persecution for the faith. And so look at a passage like James chapter 5. Beginning in verse 13, we see distinctly the difference between suffering, in other words, persecution for the faith, and sickness. There are different modes of attack, different things that we're supposed to do when these things come. Remember, verse 13, is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing psalms. Is anyone among you sick? Get that thing healed. Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of the faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, he will be forgiven. And so there's a very clear distinction between suffering, in other words, persecution for the faith, and sickness. Now, we, not me, but we at the church have taught on healing several times. Pastor Jeff did a fantastic job of teaching on healing very recently here. Patty did a very good job of teaching on healing before that. I think I have it in the right order. But we've had 2 recent series on healing. And so we have a lot of strong teaching on healing. I don't need to go over all that again. But just by way of a review and trying to tie it into where we are tonight, I think Matthew 8:16 and 17 is the key passage for the doctrine of healing, and healing being a part of the atonement and for believers, and it's ours, and it's a promise, and it's for us to fight for, and not to just wimpily come before the Lord and say, if it be your will. No, it is. Healing is the will of God for believers. Matthew 8:16 and 17, when evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed. And he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, he himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. Now, why is that so important? Because when Isaiah says he himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses, it is in the context of this passage. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. He was wounded for our transgressions, that's sins. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. In other words, Jesus healed all who were sick so that it might be fulfilled what Isaiah said. And what Isaiah said was Jesus came for our salvation. Well, you can't have it one way and not the other. It's either both or neither. Either the atonement is for our salvation and for our healing, or it's for neither. Period. Okay, now, why aren't people healed? Right, and Pastor Jeff went through this. Patty went through this. We've had this teaching before, so again, I don't have to go over it very much. But again, just to review and tie it in here, the Garden of Eden, the garden plan A for humanity did not include loss, and through the cross and through the resurrection of Jesus, the garden plan has been reinstated. In other words, our lives are meant to be lived in kingdom abundance. Well, Pastor Gabriel, it sounds like you're talking about prosperity gospel. Well, I am, in a way. Not off into goofiness. But the ideally, well, not even ideally, this is a fact. Jesus restored dominion, past tense, with the cross and the resurrection. Dominion is ours. God gave them dominion in the Garden of Eden. They lost it. They didn't lose it. They ceded it, C-E-D-E, through sin. So the enemy had dominion because they gave it away. Jesus returned dominion to us through the cross and through the resurrection. It's ours. The problem is we keep ceding it back. If we would live, we, and I mean everybody on the planet, would receive the promise of Jesus and live the way that he's made available, we would cut all this business out. But we keep ceding dominion back to the enemy, and of course the enemy is going to use it. And so not only do we live in a fallen world and a cursed world, but we live, if I can say it this way, in a refallen and recursed and perpetually fallen and cursed world, because it's happening every day. Okay? So the bottom line is bad things happen to good people. And Cole talked about it on Sunday. Why would good things happen to good people, right? Because when bad things come our way, if we're his, we should take that thing and give it to him and say, okay, Lord, use this to shape me. And he does. The bottom line is when bad things happen to good people, when believers go through stuff, whether it's sickness, disease, whether it's loss of children. Think of all the things on Job's list, right? Loss of property, loss of children, loss of whatever. Sometimes it can be our fault. Sometimes it can be our fault. Through sin. Maybe we don't receive a healing because it's tied to sin. Maybe we don't receive healing because of lack of faith. Maybe there's some fear involved. Sometimes it can be our fault. But we can't just assume that it's our fault, because sometimes it's not. Sometimes there is a situation outside of our knowledge, like curses and all kinds of other things that happen. We don't even know that it's there. And that's why going through inner healing is a good idea. And we've got tools for that, and we got people for that. And do it if you haven't done it lately. Okay? So sometimes it's our fault. Sometimes it's circumstances. Sometimes, yes, it's the product of the fall and product of the curse. But I should be able to come against that, and we do. But at the end of the day, sometimes, even in the new covenant, sometimes it's nobody's fault. And bad stuff happens to good people. And we go through the process of, okay, Lord, was this me? Is there something you want me to do different? And we get to the end of that and we say, you know what? Like Job, we say, I haven't done anything wrong. And yet this is happening. And we look to the Lord and we say, even if you kill me, I have no other choice. I'm just going to keep walking. And sometimes we do never get the answer to the question, why? Those with the Job syndrome often, and you see this in the book, if you take a look at that book, often people who go through a Job syndrome often come to the realization that they are special, if I can say it that way. In other words, they're a very strong person. God doesn't give that thing to you, but he allowed it, right? He allows everything because he could put a stop to it. And one person will look at that and say, God, you could have put a stop to this. Why didn't you? And now we're blaming God. And that's exactly what Job didn't do. But the other person looks at that and said, yeah, God could have put a stop to this, but he didn't. And he allowed me to go through something that was horrendous, that most people, see, Job syndrome, most people don't go through it. Most people don't go through Job syndrome. We all go through trials. Most people don't go through Job syndrome. It's that painful. And you are at the end of it all and you say, I got nothing. I don't know. and you're about to give up on the faith, but then you look to the Lord and you say, I got nothing. And he knows you can take it. And that doesn't help much, but it can give comfort to some to know, you know what? God knew I could handle this. And it gives you a peace. Let me close this little segment by mentioning, if I can say it this way, this is crazy. God went through his own Job syndrome. When a person goes through a Job syndrome, in other words, they're rock bottom, everything's ripped away that they love, and they got nothing. And they look to the Lord and they say, why did you do this? Why you could have, blah, blah, blah. And they go through all the steps. And then the Lord looks at them and says, I gave up my son. Is what you're going through any worse, any more difficult? And many times that person will see that and say, it comes to a greater appreciation of what the Lord did. Again, it doesn't make it easy. It doesn't make it good. But some people who go through Job syndrome have those kinds of feelings where they come to those realizations of, God was able to count on me to do this. And God himself has had the same experience, and I can take comfort in the fact that I'm not alone. And that brings us to our practical application. I want you to think through, and again, we'll do a little discussion here. Think about this for a minute. What was it like for God to give up his own son? I'm not sure we think about that maybe enough or deeply enough. So let's take some time to do it. And then how can that knowledge, the fact that God gave up his own son and watched him go through what he went through, how can that knowledge comfort us when we go through our own difficulties?